guy was working in a condenser water box, and he had an outside man, and he had a safety line. Somehow, through a valve, a faulty valve, or a line or something unbeknown to anybody, nitrogen escaped and got into it, or into the water box. And nitrogen absorbs the oxygen in the air. I guess there was about 2 inches of water in the water box. The guy passed out and fell face down into the water. When his helper went in to try to get him out, of course he was exerting himself, and he cooled it himself, just conked right out. So by the time they got the proper breathing apparatuses there to get everybody out, the boy had physically drowned in the water. So you asked me if we have to have these breathing apparatuses. Yeah, we got to have them. You're damn right we got to have them. And we got to know how to use them. The areas in the plant that you would have to have breathing apparatuses of some kind are everywhere. They're all over the plant. Dusty areas, areas where you're sandblasting, areas where chemicals are handled, tanks that might be open, guys who are painting in certain areas. They go on and on and on. The guys in the plants are pretty safety conscious. And the one thing they don't want is to have somebody working with them that doesn't know how to use this stuff.
There are many situations in the plant where you're going to have to know how to use breathing equipment properly. Some of these situations are routine maintenance jobs, and some of them are likely to be emergencies, where you're going to have to react fast to save a life. We're going to be talking about the kinds of hazards you're likely to encounter and the different types of breathing gear. We'll see how to put them on, how to use them properly, and we'll talk about the special precautions you have to take when working in dangerous atmospheres. Now, basically, there are 3 kinds of breathing hazards: particulates, gases, and lack of oxygen. Particulates are dusts and vapors in the air. Unless you're protected, the particles enter your lungs. Several kinds of toxic gases are used in the plant. Each kind may require a different type of protection. The third breathing hazard is lack of oxygen. Places like this drainage tunnel don't have enough oxygen to keep a man alive. When you go in, you have to bring your own air supply with you.
In heavier concentrations, dusts in the air will cause what we call pneumoconiosis, which is essentially dust in the lungs. And this can lead to a number of fairly serious complications. The the form of pneumoconiosis depends on what sort of dust you're breathing. If it's a free silica crystal dust, you're going to get silicosis. If it's a fibrous metal dust, you're going to get what we call asbestosis. Now, they both have the same sort of effect on the lungs. They will create, they will encourage growth of fibrous nodules in the lungs. They will strangle the bronchial passages. They can cause emphysema, chronic bronchitis, and of course cancer, lung cancer in the long run. A side effect of the pneumoconioses is the heavy labor, the heavy burden it puts on the heart. Of course, the harder you breathe to bring oxygen into your body, and you have to breathe harder depending on how impaired your lung capacity is, the harder your heart has to work to get that oxygen throughout your system. So any sort of complication with your lungs can also lead to possible heart damage. Oxygen in the air is approximately 21% of what we breathe. When it gets down to 16% for whatever reason, the human body begins to undergo considerable stress. The respiratory system speeds up as you try to pull more air into yourself to make up for the low oxygen percentage in the air. The heart starts working overtime to try and pump that oxygenated blood to the various parts of your body, so there's a possibility again of heart damage. Nausea, vomiting, you get tired very quickly, fatigue sets in rapidly, you lose your sense of judgment, again you become uncoordinated, another situation again where you don't ever want to be by yourself. As the oxygen levels drop, you will become unconscious, go into convulsions, and die. The correct use of respiratory equipment will protect you in, I would say, 100% of these situations. The use of some sort of filter media in a particulate atmosphere, the use of the proper respiratory equipment in an atmosphere that has hazardous gases, the use of air supply respiratory equipment in an atmosphere that is deficient in oxygen, the proper use, and I'd like to emphasize that because that's a key, the proper use of the proper equipment. They go hand in hand. The proper use of the proper equipment will protect us from almost any of the situations that we've described.
These devices are all called respirators. Now, there are many kinds of respirators, but we can divide them into two basic groups: air-purifying respirators and air-supplied respirators. Air-purifying respirators remove dangerous substances from the air. This paper mask filters out particles before they get into your lungs. Other kinds of air-purifying respirators, like this gas mask, have canisters that chemically absorb dangerous fumes and gases. All air-purifying respirators remove dangerous elements from the air, but they don't have an air supply of their own. That means that you can't use them in an area where there's not enough oxygen. Where there's a lack of oxygen, you need an air-supplied respirator. Air-supplied respirators can carry their own air supply in a tank, just like scuba gear, or send air to the mask through a hose or an airline. To protect yourself, you need to know how to use both kinds of respirators safely. Different situations require different kinds of protection. Let's look more closely at the kinds of hazards you'll encounter and see which ones require air-purifying respirators and which ones demand an air-supplied type. The first kind of breathing hazard is particulates, tiny particles of dust or smoke or droplets and fumes from liquids like fuel oil. Without protection, a worker in an area full of dust or fumes inhales particles with every breath. Some of the particles are exhaled, but many enter the lungs and stick to the inner walls. These particles can cause silicosis, black lung, or pneumonia. In the plant, you'll need protection from particles whenever you handle coal, insulation, or spray equipment. If particles are the only breathing hazard in an area, an air-purifying respirator is sufficient to protect your lungs. The second type of hazard is dangerous gases. Several poisons, such as chlorine and ammonia, are routinely used in the plant. Exhaust fumes and solvent fumes are also poisonous. For work in dangerous atmospheres, both air-purifying and air-supplied respirators can be used. This air-purifying respirator has canisters designed to absorb ammonia fumes. Other canisters are available for protection from other gases. Gas masks are special kinds of air-purifying respirators for use in emergencies. They're different because they can protect you in immediately hazardous atmospheres where even one breath could be harmful. For extended work in an area with a high concentration of dangerous gases, an air-supplied respirator is the only adequate protection. The third and last type of breathing hazard is lack of oxygen. There are many areas in the plant where there may not be enough fresh air to keep you alive. Ash hoppers, tanks, tunnels, those are just a few of the places where you may have to work. Any area where there may not be enough fresh air to breathe is called a confined area. If there isn't enough fresh air, you must wear an air-supplied respirator. So far, we've looked at three kinds of breathing hazards: particulates, gases, and lack of oxygen, and two basic types of respirators: air-purifying and air-supplied. For particulates, an air-purifying respirator is usually good enough. For low concentrations of dangerous gases, air-purifying respirators can also be used. But for high concentrations, air-supplied respirators are mandatory. For lack of oxygen, Air-supplied respirators are the only way to keep you breathing. Later, we'll see details on each type of respirator, where it's used, how it's used, and how it's cared for. But first, review what you've learned already by reading segment 1 of your text and working the exercises. In the last segment, we talked about why respiratory protection is sometimes necessary in the plant. The 3 hazards we discussed were particulates, dangerous gases, and lack of oxygen. We saw the 2 basic kinds of respirators, air-purifying and air-supplied. And we listened to 2 men who gave us some very good reasons for knowing how to use this equipment properly. What we're going to do in this segment is take a closer look at air-purifying respirators. We'll see several different kinds, and we'll talk about where they're used and how they're worn. But first, let's review just what an air-purifying respirator is. An air-purifying respirator is one that takes in the surrounding air when you breathe. The mask then removes contaminants from the air by filtering out particles or by chemically absorbing dangerous gases. It's important to remember that it doesn't supply oxygen. It can only be used where there's enough oxygen to support life. There are many kinds of air-purifying respirators, but we can break them down into 2 groups: filter masks and chemical cartridge respirators. Chemical cartridge respirators are the kind that absorb airborne contaminants by a chemical process. Filter masks protect your lungs from particles by filtering out dusts from the air. This is a paper filter mask. It's the simplest kind of air-purifying respirator. The paper mask has very small microscopic pores that admit air while removing particles you can't even see. You'll often use a paper mask when working with insulation, handling coal, sandblasting, or working in any dusty area. They're inexpensive, require no care. When you're done with one, simply throw it away. This shows you just how effective these masks are. The dust on this used paper mask could have ended up in someone's lungs. To make sure the mask stops all the dust, it has to be worn properly. Fit the mask over your nose and mouth and slip the elastic band around the back of your head. Then adjust the soft metal nose piece to eliminate any gaps in the seal. The foam rubber under the metal strip assures the most perfect seal possible. When the mask is adjusted properly, all of the user's air must pass through the paper. None can enter around the sides. With a correctly adjusted paper mask, you can work in dusty atmospheres confident that the mask is removing particles from the air before they reach your lungs. Now, here's another kind of filter mask. It's a felt filter mask. It's got a soft rubber skirt, an exhalation valve, and a replaceable filter element. Instead of discarding the mask after use, the element is replaced with a new one. The old filter element is removed by releasing this clip and withdrawing this wedge-shaped piece of plastic. Take off the old element and fold the new one over the wedge. Insert the wedge, fasten the clip, and you're done. The filter element should be replaced any time breathing becomes difficult or after each time the mask is used. That way, the next time you use it, you know that the mask has a clean filter. Now we've seen 2 kinds of filter masks: the paper filter mask and the felt filter mask. These are both air-purifying respirators. They're designed to remove particles from the air you breathe. if you need protection from low concentrations of gases or vapors which may be dangerous after prolonged or repeated exposure, you have to have a chemical cartridge respirator. This type of chemical cartridge respirator has a rubber body, an exhalation valve, and 2 cartridges. The mask fits over your nose and mouth like this. Now, other models may have 1 large cartridge, and some cover your whole face. Whatever kind of chemical cartridge respirator you use, it's the cartridge itself that actually removes the contaminants. Now, let's see how it works. This cartridge has a particulate filter, shown in white, and a layer of activated charcoal. Dust or other particulates are stopped by the filter, preventing the particles from being drawn into the lungs. Poisonous vapors or gases pass through the filter into the layer of charcoal. The charcoal absorbs these contaminants. Working together, the filter and the activated charcoal can remove most of certain contaminants in the air before they enter your lungs. However, not every cartridge has a particulate filter inside. Some are only good for protection from gases. In fact, most cartridges are only effective for one specific kind of contaminant. This cartridge absorbs acid gases like sulfur dioxide. This one is good for ammonia vapors. And this cartridge protects you from organic vapors and dusts of all kinds. It has a filter and a layer of charcoal. With a chemical cartridge respirator, selecting the right cartridge for the job is vital. Having the wrong kind of protection can be worse than having no protection at all. It can lead to a false sense of confidence. So, how do you select the right cartridge? Well, your supervisor will be able to tell you what kind of protection you need before you start the job. The cartridges are labeled and color-coded according to the type of contaminant they absorb. After you've picked up the right cartridges, remove the old ones from the mask. Inspect the rubber O-rings, which are in some cases situated on the cartridge themselves, but with this particular model, are located inside the mask. You want to make sure that they seal correctly. Then, all you do is select the proper cartridge, and you screw in the set. You should always start a job with a fresh cartridge. They have a limited lifetime. They become less effective after use. Now, to put the mask on, you unclip the bottom strap. Fit the mask over your nose and mouth, and pull the top strap around the back of your head, and the bottom strap around the back of your neck. Then, you adjust both straps until the mask seals firmly against your face, but not so tightly that it's uncomfortable. When the mask is properly adjusted, no air leaks around the sides. It all passes through the cartridges before reaching your lungs. The air-purifying respirator you've just seen is an example of the type that you might use in a normal work situation. Now, this is also an air-purifying respirator. It's called a gas mask. It's used in emergency situations only, for rescue or escape from an area where poisonous gases are an immediate danger. The gas mask differs from the chemical cartridge respirator in that it can be used in an atmosphere where a single exposure could be harmful or fatal. In other ways, it's very similar to the cartridge respirator. The canister on the gas mask works the same way as the cartridge. And just like the cartridges, most gas mask canisters are designed with specific contaminants in mind. There are canisters for ammonia, chlorine gas, and most other industrial breathing hazards. There's also a special canister available for gas masks that provides protection from all of the most common gases, vapors, and particulates. It's called a universal Type N canister. It's especially useful for emergencies when any of several contaminants may be present in the air. But The universal canister does have one major drawback. It doesn't protect you for as long as the canister is designed for one specific contaminant. It's intended to protect you just long enough to escape from a poisonous atmosphere or rescue someone who's in danger. Now remember, air-purifying respirators don't supply you with air. They remove contaminants from the surrounding atmosphere. That means you can't use an air-purifying respirator in any area with insufficient oxygen. Air-purifying respirators are also limited by the concentration of dangerous gases in the air. Chemical cartridge respirators are limited to very low concentrations, and gas masks are usually effective only when the concentration of dangerous gases is 2% or less. If levels rise any higher than that, an air-supplied respirator is a must, even for emergencies. In many cases, though, a gas mask can help save a life. Suppose one of your buddies suddenly passes out, even though the area has plenty of oxygen. A fire emergency. This is one type of situation where an air-purifying respirator isn't enough protection. Fire consumes oxygen fast, and the smoke and fumes from a fire like this one are much too concentrated to be stopped by a gas mask. When conditions are this severe, only an air-supplied respirator is good enough. A respirator that delivers enough fresh air for the user to breathe and work in an atmosphere containing insufficient oxygen to support life. In the plant, dangers may not always be this spectacular, but the hazards are just as real. Many areas in the plant, such as water tunnels, drains, and tanks, may not have enough oxygen to keep you alive. These are called confined areas. When you work in confined areas, you may need an air-supplied respirator. We'll be talking about two basic kinds of air-supplied respirators. They differ according to how the air is delivered to the user. In one type, air is supplied by a tank on the user's back. In the other, it's supplied from a remote location. A respirator that carries its own air supply is called a self-contained breathing apparatus. Let's see what one looks like in use. This is the bottom ash hopper of one of the main boilers in a power plant. It's a confined area. In our example, we found oxygen content is so low, a man could not survive without a constant supply of fresh air. As our maintenance mechanic unpacks his breathing gear before entering the ash hopper, he inspects each piece to prevent any unpleasant last-minute surprises. As you can see, this breathing apparatus is equipped with a full face mask. He checks the sealing edge to make sure no cracks or cuts will cause the mask to leak. The tank contains enough compressed air for approximately 30 minutes, less if the user is exerting himself and consuming more oxygen than normal. The tank is carried like a backpack, with the tank valve pointing downwards. It's held onto the user's back with two shoulder straps and a waistband made of nylon webbing. The chest buckle keeps the straps from spreading apart, making them more easily adjustable. The waist buckle keeps the tank close to the user's body and allows most of the weight to be carried by the hips. To position the tank comfortably on his back, he hoists it up as high as it will go. Each of the straps is adjustable to provide the most comfortable, secure fit possible. Both shoulder straps and the waistband. When all straps are correctly adjusted, the tank rides high and close to the user's body without swinging or shifting as he moves. The tank valve controls the supply of air to the pressure demand regulator carried on the front of the user's body. It's opened all the way so breathing will not be restricted even when tank pressure is nearly exhausted. To test the facepiece seal, he first positions the straps on the front of the mask so they'll be out of the way. With his thumb blocking the hose, he puts the mask up to his face and inhales, sucking the mask in towards the face. No air leaks, so he's now ready to begin breathing from the tank. The regulator has a red knob for the bypass valve, which should be completely closed. The yellow knob controls the demand valve. It is fully open, so air will be delivered to the mask every time the user inhales. The connector for the facepiece hose is protected by a plug when the air pack is not in use. He removes the plug and screws in the hose connector finger tight. Now he's ready to put on the mask. He puts the mask up to his face and pulls the straps over his head. The straps are adjustable to provide an airtight seal between the mask and the user's face. The nape strap is adjusted first. Then the head strap, and finally the crown strap. Now he's breathing from the tank. All that remains is to put on his hard hat, and our maintenance mechanic is ready to go to work in the ash hopper. This kind of self-contained breathing gear is often used for routine maintenance work in the plant. But even if your job doesn't involve this kind of work, it's still important for you to know how to use it properly. These units are the primary emergency breathing protection for all plant personnel. Now let's go over the controls on the air pack so you'll know what each one does. First, we've got the tank valve. It controls the flow of air from the tank to the regulator. It's the first valve you turn on when you're putting on your breathing gear. The regulator has two knobs, a red one for the bypass valve and a yellow one for the demand valve. When you're using the equipment, the demand valve should be all the way open. It's the second valve you open. The bypass valve is a safety device. If your regulator fails, twisting the bypass valve delivers a stream of air to the mask straight from the tank. It bypasses the demand valve. This regulator has another special feature. This control on the front allows you to select one of two options: demand or pressure demand. When the control is in the demand position, the regulator delivers air to the mask only when the user inhales. With the control in the pressure demand position, the regulator maintains a slight positive pressure in the facepiece. If any leakage occurs, contaminants won't enter the mask. Air will flow out instead. This special provision is for use in atmospheres that are immediately dangerous, for instance, where chlorine is present, or even a small amount of the contaminant can harm you quickly. Otherwise, it's best to use the demand option. Your air lasts longer that way. This pressure gauge on top of the regulator lets you keep track of exactly how much air you have left. And if you forgot to look, The alarm goes off when you have about 5 minutes left. That's the signal to get out. The air pack is the most commonly used type of self-contained breathing apparatus, but there's another type which we should mention briefly. It's called a rebreather. A rebreather recycles the air you breathe. The carbon dioxide you exhale is scrubbed in a special canister that generates oxygen from chemicals that are activated by the moisture in your breath. The rebreather mask has two hoses, one for inhalation and one for exhalation. Exhaled gases are sent to the canister to be scrubbed. The oxygen released by the chemical fills the two breathing bags on either side. These act as a reservoir for clean oxygen to be sent to the mask as the user inhales. These two air-supplied respirators, the air pack and the rebreather, are both self-contained breathing gear. The air supply is carried with the equipment. But we also have another kind of air-supplied respirator, the type that delivers air from a remote location. These are divided into two basic types: the airline respirator, which is supplied with compressed air from a large tank or a compressor, and the hose mask, which requires no compressed air source at all. It has a long tube that delivers air at normal pressure, either with a blower or simply by suction like a long snorkel. The airline respirator is the more common of the two. It has definite advantages over the self-contained apparatus for routine work. Connected to a compressor, there's no need to change tanks. You can work for extended periods without interruptions. However, there are also disadvantages. The airline reduces your mobility. You can only travel as far as the hose can reach. Airline respirators come in several styles. There's a full-face version, an air-supplied hood, and for special jobs, there's a suit that covers your whole body. These bubble suits are sometimes used with self-contained equipment as well. You've seen several kinds of air-supplied respirators: the self-contained apparatus and the remote-supplied type. Each kind has its advantages and disadvantages, and it's important for you to know how to use them all safely. In a few minutes, we'll be back to show you some of the techniques you can use to make sure your respirator is doing the job for which it's intended, protecting you from contaminants in the air. But first, study segment 3 of your texts and work the exercises. You've seen several kinds of respirators, and you know something about where they're used and how they're worn. Now we're going to talk about who can wear a respirator and who cannot. Not everyone can wear a respirator safely. A person with respiratory problems can't use a respirator because of the extra strain it may put on his lungs. If you have trouble breathing normally, you don't want to risk aggravating a problem you already have. There's a more common problem, though, that prevents people from wearing respirators safely. That's the case of a person who can't get a good seal between the mask and his face. Beards, eyeglasses, or facial structure can leave a gap in a seal where contaminated air can leak in. There are several tests we can use to determine whether or not the mask has a good seal. One of the simplest is called the powder and bulb test. This rubber squeeze bulb is filled with a harmless powder that's fine enough to enter even a very small gap between the mask and the subject's face. The powder is sprayed around the edges of the mask while the subject breathes normally. If any gaps exist, powder will be visible inside the mask. Excess powder is wiped off the subject's face and the outside of the mask to prevent the false indication of a leak. When the mask is removed, it's examined closely for any sign of the powder. A clean mask indicates that the facepiece is making a good seal with the subject's face. The powder and bulb test is one easy way to determine whether or not you're able to wear a respirator safely. But it's not the only one. There's another test that's just as simple and even more effective. It's called the banana oil test. The banana oil test uses a chemical called amyl acetate. It's a harmless liquid that smells like the bottom hold of a banana boat. It doesn't smell bad, it just smells like bananas. The idea of the test is, if you can smell the banana oil while you're wearing your respirator, you don't have a good seal. Air is leaking in around the edges of your mask. The test itself is simple. While the subject wears his respirator, breathing normally, the bottle is uncapped and held close to the edges of the mask. If the subject smells bananas, he knows he's not getting a good seal. With either of these tests, powder and bulb, or banana oil, it's easy to prove to yourself just how effective or ineffective a respirator is for you. You should try one of these methods at least once, just to satisfy yourself that a respirator does work for you. These tests are recommended because they're easy to do and don't require any special equipment. However, your plant may have the means to perform a more sophisticated test, a fitting booth. The air in the fitting booth contains a harmless gas. While you exercise to simulate normal on-the-job movements, an airline draws samples from inside the mask to be analyzed by this machine. The equipment measures how much, if any, of the gas in the booth has entered the face mask. If none of the gas in the booth registers on the instruments, the seal is good. If you wear your respirator properly, you will be adequately protected from airborne hazards on the job. Notice that I say wear your respirator properly. Breathing equipment won't help you at all unless you use it the right way. In the previous segments, you've watched people put on several different kinds of breathing gear. We're going to take some time now and go through the procedures for the gas mask and the air pack step by step. Now, these are both gas masks. They're full-face respirators, and they have canisters suspended from the chin of the face mask. But, as you can see, the head straps are completely different. Let's look at how each kind is put on and adjusted for a good fit. First, inspect the mask for damage that might prevent a positive seal. Then test the facepiece for a good seal by holding the mask to your face and inhaling. The mask should be sucked in toward your face and no air should leak in around the sides. If you have a good seal, remove the protective tape from the air inlet at the bottom of the canister. Put the cord around your neck, place the mask on your face, and slip the headpiece over your head. Adjust the headpiece with the knobs on the top and back until the fit is tight but not uncomfortable. The mask should stay in place with a good seal, even when you're moving around. Now, this gas mask has soft rubber straps instead of a hard plastic headpiece. To put it on, arrange the straps on the front of the mask so they'll be out of the way. Perform the suction test to make sure you have a good seal. Then remove the tape from the canister inlet as before. Now put the mask back to your face and pull the straps over your head. Tighten the nape straps, the head strap, and the crown strap, and the mask is securely in place. Knowing the right way to put on a gas mask is important. It's a piece of emergency equipment. And when you need a gas mask, you have to be able to get it on fast. Someone's life depends on it, maybe yours. The next demonstration we're going to see involves a piece of equipment you may use more often than a gas mask, the air pack. It's a little more complicated than a mask, but you may need to use it for emergencies as well as for routine jobs. First, Inspect the mask for cuts or cracks that might cause leaks. When you're satisfied, place the mask to one side in a place where it won't be scratched or stepped on. Lift the tank by the shoulder straps and place it on your back. Fasten the chest buckle and the waist buckle and hoist the tank high up on your back. Now tighten all three straps, both shoulders and the waist. When the tank is securely on your back, open the tank valve. Now it's time to test the mask for a good seal. Arrange the straps on the front of the mask out of the way. Put your thumb over the end of the hose. Press the mask against your face and inhale. If no air leaks in, you've got a good seal. Next, open the yellow demand valve on the regulator all the way. Remove the plug from the hose connector and screw in the hose finger tight. The next step is to put on the mask. Place the mask against your face and pull the straps over your head. Tighten the nape strap, the head strap, and the crown strap. Now that you're breathing through the mask, select the option you need to use with the control on the front of the regulator. Select the up position to maintain a positive facepiece pressure for immediately dangerous atmospheres. Or use the demand position if the hazard is not that severe. The air pack isn't hard to use if you remember to take it step by step. Put the tank on, open the valves, plug in the mask, and put the mask on. You'll get a chance to practice this with your instructor later on. But first, let's review what we've learned in this segment. We saw three kinds of fitting tests that can determine whether or not you're able to get a good seal with a respirator. The powder and bulb, the banana oil test, and the fitting booth. They are all effective tests. You should try at least one of them to make sure that a respirator will work for you. We saw demonstrations of the correct fitting of three kinds of breathing equipment, two kinds of gas masks, and the air pack. We'll take a short break now for you to read segment 4 of your text and begin practicing with some different kinds of breathing gear. When we return, we'll take a look at how breathing apparatus is used for some typical jobs at the plant. You've learned quite a bit about respirators by now. You know about air-purifying respirators and air-supplied respirators. You've seen how they work and where and how they're worn. What we're going to talk about now is the special precautions and techniques used with respirators in a working situation. Now, obviously, working in a dangerous atmosphere with a respirator is neither as easy nor as safe as working in fresh air without special equipment. Breathing gear is bulky and reduces your ability to move around freely, and even small mistakes can have very serious consequences in a dangerous atmosphere. There are some special things you can do, though, that will help you cope with these problems when you have to work with a respirator. Let's watch these two mechanics as they repair a leaky valve on an ammonia line. The mechanics are wearing half-face chemical cartridge masks and sealed goggles. The cartridges in the masks are designed to absorb ammonia vapors. Whenever you wear a respirator, remember that it sticks out from your face. You have to be careful not to dislodge the mask with an accidental bump. And it helps to work out some hand signals in advance, too. You can't take the mask off to explain something to your helper. Planning the job in advance can save a lot of problems when you start the work. Make sure your helper knows what you're doing and make your movements slow and deliberate. Trying to rush a job is just asking for trouble. Teamwork is vital whenever you're working in a hazardous atmosphere. There must always be someone standing by to help you out if you get into a jam. If you have any problem breathing, or if you feel ill, get out of the contaminated area and remove your respirator. The two men we just saw were working in an area where ammonia vapors were the hazard. Let's take a look at a different kind of job, working in a confined area. Before you enter a confined area, the atmosphere inside must be tested for oxygen content and explosive gases. This device is called a sniff tester. A plastic tube is lowered into the tunnel to bring an air sample to the test instrument. The tester measures the amounts of oxygen and explosive gases. This tunnel is low on oxygen and contains methane, a flammable gas. So, an air-supplied respirator is required. This worker must enter the tunnel to investigate a blocked drain. He uses an air pack, just like the ones we've seen demonstrated before. He's worked in confined areas on other occasions, and he knows the right precautions. He not only has to wear his breathing gear properly, he must also avoid making sparks that might ignite the flammable gas, causing an explosion. As he prepares to enter, the other man also puts on his breathing gear. This man will not enter the tunnel unless there's an emergency. His job is to stand by the opening with his respirator on. He'll be ready to enter if it becomes necessary for him to do so. The worker who must enter the tunnel checks each of the straps on his harness, making sure none of them are twisted or kinked before he fastens the buckles. After the chest buckle was fastened, he clipped together the waist buckle. Each strap was adjusted so that the tank fits close to the body, high up on the back. Inside the tunnel, movements will be restricted by the size of the tank, so it's important that it doesn't sag or swing as he works. Once the tank is securely adjusted, he opens the tank valve all the way. He checks the pressure gauge on the regulator to make sure he's got a full tank of air. Next, he adjusts the face piece. After arranging the straps on the front of the mask, he checks the sealing edge for any problems that might cause leaks. He doesn't see any damage, but he performs the suction test as a matter of routine, just to be certain the mask seals correctly to his face. The test shows that he does have a good seal, so he opens the demand valve all the way. He removes the plug from the facepiece hose connector, places it in the box, and connects the hose, being careful not to cross-thread the fitting. To put the mask on, he slips the straps over his head. The next step is to adjust all the straps. The nape straps, the head straps, and the crown strap. Now the mask seals to his face correctly without being so tight that it's uncomfortable. The hard hat is next. Then one more piece of safety gear is required. A safety belt. It's made of thick leather with an extra strong buckle. After it's secured to the worker's waist, a lifeline will be attached to a hook on the back. The safety man tends the lifeline while the worker is in the confined area. The line provides a way to haul the worker out of danger if he loses consciousness. The lifeline that's used here is made of rope, but sometimes lifelines made of braided steel cable are used instead. Anytime you use a cable as a lifeline, be careful around electrical equipment. Ground it. So if it contacts a live wire, the current flows through the ground wire, not through your body. As the worker enters the tunnel, he's careful not to bump the air pack on the opening. The safety man pays out line as the worker descends, keeping it taut so that the man below can signal with a tug on the line. This example shows again just how important teamwork can be when you're working in dangerous atmospheres. The safety man is responsible for keeping track of the man in the confined area at all times. If the worker appears to be in any kind of difficulty, the safety man should first attempt to help him out with the lifeline. If this is not possible, the safety man should notify a supervisor of the emergency before he enters the confined area himself. Otherwise, two men might be in trouble and no one would be aware of their problem. Before beginning work in a confined area, take the time to plan out the job in advance. Your partner should know everything you intend to do, or he might not know when you are in trouble. Work out your signals in advance. Just for an example, you might use one tug on the lifeline to mean pay out more line. Two tugs might mean I'm coming up. And three tugs could mean pull me up fast. Whatever signals you use, make sure both of you understand exactly what they mean. The last demonstration showed the most important things to remember when working in a confined area. Sample the atmosphere so you know what the dangers are. Have a safety man at the opening with breathing gear on, and use a lifeline in case the man inside gets into trouble. If you do any burning or welding inside a confined area, there's one more special precaution. An inspector must check out the area and give you the okay before you go in. We've been talking about how respirators are used on the job. But what about after the work is finished? You'll return your respirator to a qualified technician who will clean the mask, disinfect it, and inspect it for any damage or possible malfunction. He uses a checklist like this one to record all of his findings. If you had any trouble with your mask, or if you suspect it may need maintenance, report it to the technician or to your supervisor. In cases like this, it's much better to be safe than sorry. Face masks and other rubber parts are washed with soap and water, thoroughly rinsed, and disinfected before being used again. Rubber parts are stretched and inspected for holes, cracks, and tears. Any damaged parts are replaced or repaired only by a qualified technician. Don't attempt to make repairs yourself. The technician records all the pertinent information on a checklist. It's a good idea to keep the checklist with the equipment in its storage container. This technician is also responsible for the disposal of used canisters. Rebreather canisters have to be disposed of in a special way. The canisters are punctured and immersed in soapy water to neutralize the chemicals inside. This precaution is necessary because these chemicals generate pure oxygen and the canisters get hot. If there are any oily impurities in the water, the result will be an explosion. You've learned a lot about breathing equipment during this session. First, we talked about kinds of breathing hazards you're likely to encounter in the plant: particulates, dangerous gases, and lack of oxygen. We discussed the two basic kinds of respiratory protection: air-purifying respirators and air-supplied respirators. And we talked about how they work, where they're used, and how to put them on properly. We watched workers performing the kinds of jobs where respiratory protection is typically required. And finally, we discussed the care and maintenance of respiratory apparatus. So, you now know how the equipment works, how to use it, and the precautions that are required for working in dangerous atmospheres. Before you use any breathing gear, read the manufacturer's instructions and follow them. When you practice with respiratory apparatus, remember, it's designed to save a life, maybe even yours.